Someone get this man out of my briefing room. Now the words landed like a gavel, hard, final, expecting instant compliance. Colonel Dennis Strickland stood in the doorway of Conference Room B at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in full-service uniform, ribbons straight, boots mirror polished. A man who had spent 23 years making rooms rearrange themselves around him. He was 46 years old, broad through the shoulder, with the close-cropped silver hair and the permanent furrow between his brows of a man for whom impatience had become a resting state. He was holding a folder of briefing materials and looking at the far end of the room. At the far end of the room, an old man was cleaning. His name was Arthur Lee Giddens, and he was 78 years old, and he was pushing a wide dust mop along the baseboard with the particular unhurried thoroughness of someone who had decided long ago that if a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing to the end of the wall. He wore the gray uniform of the civilian janitorial contractor, shirt, trousers, soft-soled shoes, and a laminated badge clipped to his breast pocket. He was not tall. His shoulders had the slight forward curve of a man who had carried weight over a long period, and his hair was white and close-cropped, and his hands on the mop handle were large and deliberate, the knuckles prominent, the fingers wrapped around the wood with the automatic authority of hands that had gripped things that mattered. He had not looked up when the door opened. He had not looked up when the colonel spoke. He continued moving the mop in the long, slow arc of his work, the way a man continues doing a thing when he has determined that the thing requires finishing and that whatever is being said in the room does not change that calculation. Strickland stared at him. Behind Strickland, in the corridor, two junior officers, Captain Walsh and Lieutenant Ferris, hovered with the barely contained unease of men waiting to see which way the weather broke. "Sergeant," Strickland said, his voice dropping to the register he used when he was being very clear and expected to be obeyed immediately, "I am talking to you." Arthur Giddens raised his eyes. They were gray, deep-set beneath heavy brows gone white, the color of river water over limestone, and they held in them a quality that had nothing to do with the mop or the uniform or the contractor badge, a quality of distance, of having looked at many things from positions that reorganized what looking meant. He looked at Colonel Strickland with the even, unhurried attention of a man who had been shouted at by better and survived. "Sir," he said. His voice was low and level, the texture of old wood, dry, dense, carrying. "I'll be out of your way in 10 minutes. Just finishing the baseboards." Strickland stepped into the room. His jaw was set. "You'll be out of my way right now. This briefing starts in 15 minutes, and I need this room clear and set. You should have been finished an hour ago." "The room before this ran long," Arthur said. He had lowered his eyes back to the baseboard and was moving the mop again with the same deliberate thoroughness. "I'll be done." Strickland looked at the two junior officers in the doorway. They looked back at him with the careful blankness of men who were not going to have an opinion on this, unless required to. "What is your supervisor's name?" Strickland said, turning back to Arthur. "Mr. Bellamy. He's in the building." "I'll be calling Mr. Bellamy. And I'll be noting in that call that his employee, Strickland, crossed the room in 6 measured steps, putting himself 8 feet from Arthur, the posture of a man who uses proximity as punctuation, refused a direct instruction from a senior officer on an active installation. On a briefing day, with a room that should have been cleared 45 minutes ago. He paused. "Set down the mop and leave. I will not ask again." Arthur reached the corner of the wall. He lifted the mop, tapped the accumulated dust into the collection bag, and turned to face Strickland directly for the first time. He was not tall. Strickland had 4 inches on him, and he held the mop across his body in a relaxed, two-handed grip and looked at the colonel with the specific undefendedness of a man who had nothing to protect. because there was nothing in the room that could touch what he actually was. 10 minutes, he said. Not defiant, not pleading. Simply stating the remaining time required to complete the work. Strickland's eyes narrowed. Conference Room B was one of 12 briefing spaces in the Fort Jackson Administrative Complex, a long single-story brick building that smelled of floor wax and printer toner and the particular institutional coffee that had been burning in the same style of urn since approximately 1987. Outside, the South Carolina February held its specific gray. Not the punishing cold of a northern winter, but the damp, low-pressure chill of a climate that could not quite decide. The air carrying the smell of wet pine from the tree line beyond the motor pool, and the distant sound of a formation somewhere across the post. Voices carrying the cadence count in a way that made the distance impossible to measure. The overhead lights were fluorescent, the conference table was government-issue veneer, the chairs were stackable, and had been. On the wall hung a framed installation mission statement and a photograph of the post commander. The window at the far end looked out onto the parking lot, where a line of government-plated sedans sat in the damp morning gray, and beyond them, the flagpole, the colors moving in the February air with the slow, deliberate dignity of something that did not hurry. It was the kind of room that existed to hold meetings, and it held them in the anonymous, purposeful way of rooms that have hosted 10,000 decisions and absorbed nothing particular from any of them. The men who had sat around this table had mostly forgotten they had sat here. The table remembered nothing. This was about to change. Captain Walsh, in the doorway, was watching the old man. He had been watching him since Strickland walked in, and what he was watching with was the particular attention of a man who cannot name what he is noticing, but cannot stop noticing it. The stillness, partly, the absence of fear in someone being dressed down by a colonel on their own installation, not the numbness of someone who had stopped caring, but the genuine unconcern of someone who had calibrated what was serious at a level that made this moment register as something below the threshold. Walsh had seen that quality once before, in a master sergeant at his first duty station who had served 3 combat tours and who carried himself in precisely that way, as if the world's ordinary aggression were weather, and he had already decided what clothes to wear. He remembered asking that sergeant major how he did it, how he stayed that still when people pushed. The man had looked at him and said, "When you've been pushed by real things, Walsh, the small things stop feeling like pushing." He hadn't fully understood it then. He was beginning to understand it now, watching an old man with a dust mop decline to be moved by a colonel. He filed it without acting on it. Not yet. But the filing was deep. Strickland was not done. He turned to Walsh. "Captain, have this man escorted out and contact his supervisor. Tell Bellamy I want a formal incident report on my desk by end of day." Walsh nodded and stepped into the room, moving toward Arthur with the diplomatic discomfort of a man asked to do a thing he did not feel good about. He was 6 feet away when he stopped. Something had changed. He could not say what exactly. Arthur Giddens had not moved, had not altered his expression, had not done anything that Walsh could point to. But in the 10 seconds since Strickland had issued the order, something in the room's air had shifted in the way air shifts before lightning, not visible, not tangible, but absolutely present. Walsh stopped. He looked at Arthur. He looked at the mop. He looked at Arthur's hands on the mop handle, and the hands were the thing, those large, deliberate, entirely untroubled hands, and something in Walsh's chest said, "Wait, sir," Walsh said to Strickland, "can I have a moment?" Strickland looked at him. "Walsh, 1 moment, sir, please." He took his phone out and walked back into the corridor. Lieutenant Ferris looked at him with the expression of someone watching a man make a decision that could go very badly. Walsh ignored him. He dialed the number for post-administration and asked for the Directorate of Plans training, mobilization, and security. He asked for Sergeant Major Tolliver, who was the most decorated enlisted man Walsh had personally encountered since his commissioning, and who had, at one point over a beer, mentioned a name in a context Walsh had never forgotten. "This is Tolliver." "Sergeant Major, this is Walsh." Headquarters Company. "I'm in Conference Room B with Colonel Strickland. We have A situation, A civilian contractor, janitorial staff." He paused. His name is Arthur Giddens. The silence that followed was not long, but was absolute. The silence of a line that has gone completely still because the person on the other end has stopped doing everything else. Walsh, Tolliver's voice had changed to something direct and stripped down. "Is he all right?" "Yes, Sergeant Major. He's fine." "Strickland is," Walsh lowered his voice. "The colonel is asking him to leave before he's finished, and it's getting, I just thought someone should know the name." 3 seconds of silence. "Don't let Strickland touch him." A pause. "I mean that. Tell Strickland there's been an administrative error and you need 5 minutes. Tell him anything." "I'm coming." The line shifted. A chair, movement, and then Tolliver's voice away from the receiver, low and urgent, saying a name Walsh couldn't catch. And then a different voice answering. And then the quality of sound in the background changed the way the quality of sound changes in a room when everyone in it has stopped what they were doing and started doing the same new thing. Walsh had never heard a phone call change a room he couldn't see before. He heard it now. "Sergeant Major," Walsh said. But the line was already in motion, and Tolliver was already talking to someone else. And what Walsh caught in the background before the call ended was his own Sergeant Major's voice saying the name a second time to someone who responded with a silence that was somehow louder than words. Walsh went back into the room. "Sir," he said to Strickland, "I need 2 minutes to sort out the scheduling issue with facilities. There may have been an administrative overlap." He held Strickland's gaze with every ounce of the professional composure he had spent 6 years cultivating. "Just 2 minutes." Strickland looked at him for a long moment. "2 minutes, Walsh? Then this man is out, and I want that report." In the DPTM's office, Sergeant Major Tolliver was already in the corridor, already on his radio, already saying a name to the post sergeant major, who was saying it to the chief of staff, who was stepping out of the morning briefing cycle to make a phone call that moved the way the name of Arthur Lee Giddens always moved when it was spoken to someone who understood military history, like current, like voltage, like a thing that could not be held by ordinary channels. The post commander, Major General Sandra Okafor, was in a vehicle inspection on the motor pool when her aide reached her. She listened. She said nothing for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Get my car to the admin building." Now, she was in her service dress. She had 2 stars. She did not break into a run across the motor pool, but she moved in a way that made running look like an underreaction. She arrived in 8 minutes. She came through the front entrance of the admin building, aide at her shoulder, and walked the length of the corridor to Conference Room B without stopping. Walsh was in the doorway. He stepped aside. She walked past him into the room. Strickland, who had been standing at the head of the conference table reviewing his briefing materials with the controlled irritation of a man counting down someone else's clock, looked up and came to attention with the involuntary snap of a man who has been caught in a posture he would have composed differently. "General," he said. She did not look at him. Her eyes had found Arthur Giddens at the far end of the room, where he had continued his work through all of it, moving the wide mop with the same steady arc, reaching the final section of baseboard, the work almost done. Major General Okafor walked to the end of the room. She stopped in front of Arthur Giddens. He raised his eyes to her. She had read his file in the car on the way over. Her aide had pulled it on the phone, reading key lines while she listened, and the installation slid past the window. She had heard the dates: 1965, 1966, 1967, 1968, the years that meant something specific in the history of the Army's hardest work. She had heard the unit designations: 5th Special Forces Group, MACSOG, 1st SFOD Delta from its founding. She had heard the awards read aloud in sequence, and the sequence had the weight of a litany: Silver Star, Silver Star, Distinguished Service Cross, 4 Purple Hearts, the third of which had come from a fragmentation wound received while he was already carrying a wounded sergeant on his back in Grenada. A wound he had not reported until after the sergeant was delivered to the aid station, because reporting it earlier would have required him to put the sergeant down. She had heard the combat tours counted. She had heard the years of service, 26, and done the arithmetic of what 26 years between 1965 and 1991 contained. She had said nothing in the car. Her aide had said nothing either. Something passed between them that was not a word and not a gesture. The specific recognition of two people who understand a language that the room does not share. Then the general's right hand came up. She held the salute. Rigid, complete, directed at the old man in the gray contractor uniform, the laminated badge still clipped to his breast pocket. The mop handle resting against the wall where he'd placed it. The room went so still that the fluorescent lights were audible. Arthur Lee Giddens straightened to his full height, and it was only in that moment, in the particular gathering of his posture, that something of what he had been became briefly visible beneath the gray uniform: the set of the spine, the placement of the feet. The way a man stands when standing is something he was trained to do at a level most people will never approach. He returned the salute with a precision that had not dimmed in 30 years. Strickland's folder was on the table. He did not remember putting it there. Major General Okafor lowered her hand. She turned to face the room. When she spoke, her voice filled Conference Room B without effort, without theater, with the clean authority of someone who has never needed volume to be heard. Sergeant Major Arthur Lee Giddens served in the United States Army from 1965 to 1991. 26 years. He served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 5th Special Forces Group and was subsequently assigned to 1st SFOD Delta at its founding in 1977, where he served for 11 years as an operations sergeant major. He participated in operations in Grenada, Panama, and the Gulf. He was awarded the Silver Star twice. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. He has 4 Purple Hearts. She paused, letting the arithmetic of that settle. He holds the Combat Infantryman badge with 2 stars, which means he participated in active ground combat in 3 separate wars. Another pause. The men in his element called him the Stone. Not because he was hard. Because when everything around him was moving, he did not. She looked at Strickland. The order he never failed to obey, Colonel, was the one that mattered. The one that meant someone was still alive who needed to stay that way. Strickland stood at the head of the table. He was a man who had given orders for 23 years and been obeyed for 23 years, and he was standing in a room where the ground had shifted entirely beneath him, and he was doing his level best to absorb it without visible disintegration, which was, Walsh thought, at least a reasonable response to the situation. Major General Okafor turned back to Arthur. "Sergeant Major," she said quietly, "I'm sorry this happened." Arthur Giddens picked up his mop. He looked at the final 2 feet of baseboard, the section he hadn't reached. He ran the mop along it in one clean stroke. "Room's done, ma'am," he said. "You can have it." He collected his equipment. He nodded once to the general. He walked out of Conference Room B and down the corridor with the unhurried, rooted step of a man who has somewhere to be and knows exactly how long it takes to get there. In the doorway, Colonel Dennis Strickland watched him go. Then Strickland set down his briefing folder. He walked out into the corridor. He caught Arthur 10 feet from the door, and his voice, when he found it, was a different instrument than it had been 20 minutes ago. Quieter, scraped clean of its performance register. The voice of a man speaking without an audience for the first time all morning. "Sergeant Major," he said, "I owe you an apology. A direct one, from me, without qualifications." He stopped. "I didn't know who you were." Arthur turned. He looked at Strickland with those gray, limestone water eyes. "That's the point, Colonel," he said. "Not unkindly, the way a teacher says a thing when the student has arrived finally at the lesson. That's always been the point." He paused. "You do it right whether anyone's watching or not. Whether they know who you are or not. Whether they thank you or not." He held Strickland's gaze for a moment. "That's not a hard thing to understand. It's just a hard thing to do." He turned and walked down the corridor. Strickland stood in the corridor for a long moment after he had gone. Walsh was behind him, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing adequate to say, which was itself a kind of instruction. Down the hall, Arthur Giddens turned the corner with his cart and disappeared. And the sound of the wheels on the tile faded, and then there was only the institutional quiet of the building going about its ordinary business, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant sound of a printer, someone's phone ringing twice and stopping. The building did not know that anything had happened. The corridor did not commemorate it. The work just continued, the way it always did, and the man who had given 26 years to the country that built these buildings went about his portion of it, without asking the buildings to notice. It was 7 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, that Colonel Dennis Strickland arrived at the Administrative Building 45 minutes before his first scheduled meeting, which was not his normal habit. He went to the custodial supply room on the ground floor and knocked. Arthur Giddens opened the door. He was reading a newspaper at the small table beside the supply shelves, a cup of coffee at his elbow, in no apparent hurry to be anywhere. Strickland stood in the doorway. He had left his folder in his office. He was in his service uniform, and it struck Arthur, for reasons he didn't examine, that the man looked less armored in it than he had the last time. "I wanted to ask you something," Strickland said. "If you have a minute." Arthur gestured at the empty chair across the table. Strickland sat. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands, which were folded in front of him, and then he looked up. "How do you do it?" he said. "Come in every morning and just do the work. After everything." He paused. "How do you not need people to know?" Arthur considered the question. He picked up his coffee. He set it down. "The work is the thing," he said. "The work doesn't care what you did before. It just needs to get done." He looked at Strickland steadily. "When you stop needing the room to see you, Colonel, you start seeing the room. That's when you get useful." He picked up his newspaper. Strickland sat with that for a while in the quiet of the supply room, the institutional morning sounds of the building coming awake around them, and he had the particular sensation of a man who has been given a key and is only now finding the lock it fits. There are men like Arthur Giddens in every building, at every base, behind every service door and supply closet and maintenance cart. Men who gave everything, came home, and kept giving without changing their posture or asking for the applause. They are not hiding. They are simply doing the work. And the work, as they will tell you if you ask, is the point. If you were moved by Arthur's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes.